we have a question here about verbal communication, right? Your friend says, let's eat comma Bob rather than let's eat Bob. You know that he's not talking about eating a friend or being a cannibal, but is talking about eating together. So there's different rules that we use to communicate and understand the different words. So how many folks think A, syntactic? B, semantic? C, pragmatic? Or D, contextual? Okay, so we've got a little bit of a split here. So the best answer here is syntactic. Syntactic refers to the use of syntax, the way that we use grammar and punctuation in order to structure and make sense of a sentence. So we used the example last class of eats, shoots, and leaves, right? A panda walks into a bar, it eats, shoots, and leaves, right? It's eating bamboo shoots and leaves because that's part of its diet. And we know because of the commas that it's not actually walking into a bar and firing a gun. So the distinction here between these three, right, is that the semantic definition is the dictionary definition, right? So we might know eat means to consume something. So we might use that to start to figure out, oh, let's eat, Bob, right? Syntactic is how we use grammar, structure, and punctuation. So it's the presence or absence of a comma in eat, shoots, and leaves, or let's eat, Bob, right? And then the pragmatic is how we're using words for the situation. So as I kind of talked about last class, right, the term shoots and leaves might refer to bamboo shoots or leaves off of a plant, or it might refer to shooting something like a gun, or leaving or departing a premises. So we choose the words that fit for the situation in a pragmatic style. In this situation, because this question is asking about the punctuation and grammar being used in the sentence, syntactic is the best response here. Contextual is not one of the three major rules for language being talked about here, so it's not the best answer. So this is a somewhat more tricky question, but it's just a chance for you to refresh on some of this material. Again, the midterm in this class is not closed book or note. You are able to use your notes in the reading, but because it's timed, a lot of times you're not going to be able to leaf through multiple pages to find the answer. So the easier way to do that is to put together the notes that you have so far and have them as a reference or a study guide. The midterm is not for a little while. It's between November 3rd and November 5th, but again, I think this is good for helping us to keep pace and follow along with material in the class. So last class, on Monday, I went over the group discussion leading. So again, you're assigned a date, people to work with. You have about 15 to 20 minutes in class. You do not need to be comprehensive or go over every single thing that's covered in that reading, right? Instead, you might focus on an element or section that especially stands out to you or is interesting. You might use an extended example to talk about that and so on. So it's up to you. I also would like you to turn in that outline that goes over the key ideas you're going to do in your discussion leading. Both the example outline as well as the rubric for discussion leading are available on Canvas for you to use. I'm also happy to look over or talk through your ideas or a rough draft outline ahead of time. We also spent some time last class talking about language and verbal communication. Remember that verbal communication is using symbols, whether they're spoken or written, to communicate. So the use of sign language is considered verbal communication. But something such as nodding or smirking, right, would not fit under that because it's not using words or symbols directly. We also kind of talked about language and its application to current events and issues, right, including the use of muted group theory and the challenges of speaking on behalf of a language that you might not have had a major part of contributing to. Again, that is available for you on Canvas to use as you're preparing for discussion leading. You have 15 to 20 minutes to discuss what interested or stood out to you. And I posted a Canvas announcement on Monday that details the group and the day that group members are scheduled to present. So if you've looked through that and you know there's an issue or conflict, please let me know as soon as possible. If things happen suddenly, like you suddenly need to go into quarantine and it affects your discussion leading, That's not going to negatively affect your grade or affect grade of group members, right? It just means we'll be able to work out an alternative time or way for you to do that. So I'll be giving you some time to go over and meet with your discussion leading groups. After that, we'll get into nonverbal communication and some examples of nonverbal communication in action. So what I'm going to do now is give you some time with your groups, so about 10 minutes or so, and some of the things that you might consider working on with your groups, and I'll post those in just a minute, are sharing basic things if they're people that you don't know. For instance, people that you haven't met before. You might share some basic contact information, ways to get in touch. You might also talk about how your group members intend to work together, right? So are you going to be meeting outside of class? Are you going to use like a text chain or thread? Are you going to use Google Docs or slides and so on? And then you might start to work backwards and think, okay, what's my timeline? Maybe by, next Monday, we're going to have a rough draft of our outline, something like that. So this will give you the chance to start to work with your group members and get a sense for how you intend to finish the project. What I'm going to do is go over the groups and ask people to raise their hand when I identify the different groups. That way you can look around, see where the other students are, and use that as an opportunity to meet up and to work with them. So, if you are part of the October 25th group, which is Tandy, Gracie, Presley, and Ashton on the topic of talking, raise your hand. Yeah, so you all are pretty clustered together, so it should be easy for you to take some time and talk. Alina, Mia, and Haley. Okay, got Alina and Mia here. Is Haley here? Oh, Haley said that she was sick, so you might reach out to Haley through Canvas. But for now, you two are able to work together and take some time to chat. Zachary, Sarah, Logan, and Andrew. Awesome. So it looks like 3 of you are here. You're a little bit spread out, so you might decide, where you might like to meet or migrate to. Brianna, Meg, Jackson, and Marcel. Awesome. You all are also a little bit spread out, so you might find a place to meet together. Hannah, Guy, Carson, and Katie. Okay. So find a place to work together, and then Ryan, Greer, Hector, Callie, and Jack. Last group mostly over here, so you might want to just move over a little bit to work together. So find your other group members or move to where your other group members are located. Again, we'll take about 10 minutes for you to talk to, get to know your group members, and start to develop a plan for how you're going to do discussion leading going forward.
I think it is. I think we're supposed to read the clock on chapter or whatever. She's like, no, I'm almost at the end. You can do it. Presley, what's your name?
Yes.
What do you do? I'm an engineer right now. It's like really, the hardest part is like, yeah, I did. I'm like kind of slack. Yeah. We're supposed to be starting early.
Hi, guy. What can I do for you?
Is it Katie? Is an online student, or she just not come today?
She's registered for the class, but I think she's had some troubles with trying to get her schedule and stuff all worked out. So I would recommend messaging her through Canvas. If you don't hear from her, your group members are welcome to work together, just kind of without her, right? But you know, I'll message her as well and see how things are going. So
Okay, so first just text her
Yeah.
and then we'll see.
yeah. So for the time being, do what you can together, and if she is able to join, then she'll be able to add to that.
Okay, but she basically never show up this class.
She hasn't really been in the class much, no. I haven't really seen her, so you might just check in. So if you have any members of your group that are absent, if you haven't already, you might consider messaging them on Canvas or reaching out to them. If you ever have a situation where you're continuing to try to message somebody and you never hear back, please let me know too.
You guys ever do that? Sometimes, like, you guys go through the app, like, you do, like, a class, like, through the year, and then you still, like, Shut the fuck up. Like, that's like beyond the point. It's beyond the point. Oh, yeah, dude. Dude, yeah, okay, it was like a bad deal. I got salty. Okay, it's a long story. Long story, man, long story. Remember, you were there for me, and they feel back. But they will pet your dog out.
True.
Yeah. You believe that shit? You can delete it off their Visco. So they have still a picture of your dog on their Visco.
I don't even use this go anymore. That's funny. You have this go?
No. No. I never even downloaded that shit. So like people always have it over there.
Yeah. I was really yeah. Did you do it?
Are there any groups that would like some more time on this? Awesome. So hopefully you all had the chance to get to know each other a little bit better, to share some information about each other. I think this can both be a great way to get to know other students better, get to know each other's names, and a little bit about some of the things that excite us. And again, this is not a formal public speaking thing, and having other people in the group to help you out, I think can help a lot for stuff like this. Remember as well that while you're working together as a group, you are going to be graded individually based on kind of your contribution and participation within the assignment, right? So if you ever have any issues where like you have a group member you've tried to reach out to, but they're not coming to class or not responding, just let me know and I'll be able to work with you on that. So hopefully this gives you a beginning of a plan on how to work on this assignment. Again, I really recommend using something like a shared Google Doc or Google Slides or so on to start to work together. You could even break up your outline itself into who's going to share that section of the outline. So one way to do that is, right, take like half a page of your outline and say, okay, well, John's going to do this, and Katie is going to do this part, right? That's one way that you can go about that. But again, there's a lot of flexibility about the way that you might choose to do that for discussion leading. One other thing that I wanted to mention too, since it came up in my afternoon interpersonal communication class, totally unrelated, but if you ever need to do something like use the restroom or go get a drink of water, you can do that. Like, you don't need to ask, right? I mention that because in my 1 p.m. class, a student asked if they needed to use the restroom. I'm like, of course. And they were like, well, I have a professor who requires us to ask. And I thought that was weird, but If you've ever had a situation like that in another class, know that you don't need to do that here. You know, you're adults, you're able to do what you need to take care of yourself, and that's okay. So, let's talk a little bit about nonverbal communication. So this directly follows up to our last class on verbal communication, and both of these things together make up a huge part of interpersonal communication in general, right? So interpersonal communication between two people, often meant to fulfill needs. Nonverbal is a huge element of how we communicate with each other. So nonverbal communication uses styles other than words, whether they're spoken or written, to communicate, right? So these things might include eye contact. How do you look or not at other people, and how does that shape your communication? How do you use body language? So for instance, things such as gesturing, physical space or proximity to another person, right? Or social cues. So how do those things help to make up or define the way that you communicate? So for example, I could be talking about this, but I like to wander back and forth so that, you know, I have the chance to talk to and be closer to people on the other side of the room. So nonverbal communication is kind of the difference between it's nice to meet you versus actually physically shaking somebody's hand. And one of the things that's been interesting and especially challenging in the context of COVID-19 have been the ways that we're limited in how we can express ourselves nonverbally. If you're wearing a mask, right, it's difficult to identify people's facial expressions, reactions, and so on. If we're using physical and social distancing, we're avoiding things such as touch. It can make our way of engaging with each other a lot more challenging too, right? Social distancing and physical distance to other people is one factor. It means that we have to project and use our voices a lot more loudly. It also means that we might avoid some methods of touch that we would normally use, like going to shake somebody's hand. If you're like me, when COVID initially started, right, I was going to shake somebody's hand when I did a job interview, and I was like, oh geez, I shouldn't do that, right? And I kind of withdrew it. So there's a lot of ways that we instinctually have had to adjust the way that we engage non-verbally. And that gets to the core idea that you cannot not communicate. So even if you're sitting in the class and you're not saying anything, right, or you're just taking notes or something like that, you still have your body language, your facial expressions, your clothing, right, that you're choosing to wear, and so on, that are impacting and affecting the way that you're presenting yourself to other people. That's nonverbal communication. So whether you're wearing a sweatshirt from Eastern Oregon or from Texas, right, we're always engaging in nonverbal communication. So I mentioned earlier in the quarter the example of the film Inside Out. Raise your hand if you've seen this movie. Yeah, so several of you. It's a really good example of how we use nonverbal communication because it deals with the universality of emotions, right? Not only do we know that the different characters on the show, which are different emotions in somebody's head, right, we not only know through their names that they're emotions, but also because of the way that they're expressed non-verbally. The use of color, blue for sadness, red for anger, their facial expressions, being kind of sad or glum versus furrowing your brows and actually being angry, right? This is such an interesting example of using nonverbal communication because the visual depiction of emotions reveals to us how we nonverbally express ourselves to other people, right? We got somebody with big googly eyes who's like hunched over and expressing fear. So nonverbal communication is huge. Most of the communication that we do, at least in a face-to-face situation, is nonverbal. In fact, it can be up to 93%. One of the big ideas here is that we tend to be more trusting of nonverbal communication relative to verbal communication, right? Words lie, but our expressions reveal truth. So if you're saying, it's so nice to see you, and somebody seems bored or disgusted, we're more likely to think, no, they don't think it's nice to see us, right? They're just saying that. They're really feeling bored, unhappy, frustrated, and so on. So we tend to attribute a lot more truth to what's happening nonverbally. Nonverbal communication can also be misinterpreted, right? So if somebody has Tourette's syndrome and that causes the sort of nonverbal expressions that they do to not necessarily have specific meaning, right? Then that can be one cause of misinterpretation. It can also be something that's always there. Again, we're always doing nonverbal communication, whether we want to or not, right? It can be everything from the clothes that you wear to the expressions that you're making, your physical proximity to other people, and so on. Nonverbal communication can also be very ambiguous. It can be really unclear. So one challenge that a lot of people might experience is an inability to identify or detect sarcasm. That's especially true if something is texted or written verbally, right? Somebody might use the slash and S to indicate that what they're typing is sarcastic because we lack the same cues to identify that in a nonverbal way, right? If it's just written, it's a lot harder to tell the tone and honesty of what they're trying to say. It also provides context, right? It helps us to understand the dynamics of communication. So if I were to say we have to go there versus we have to go there, or we have to go there, right? The word that I'm choosing to emphasize in that sentence is going to change the context and meaning of that sentence. If I'm saying we have to go there, and I'm pointing over to the other side of campus, that's going to tell you, okay, that's where we need to go, or we have to go there, identifies that it's immediate or significant. It's also used for our relationships, right? We use nonverbal communication as a way to reinforce and manage the relationships that we have every day. So if we see a good friend, we tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, it's great to see you. Especially our use of touch is a common way that we can regulate and manage many of the feelings that we might have. And it can also involve the use of universal language such as emotions. Again, Inside Out is a classic example because it uses literal characters who are human emotions to depict the range of human experiences. So it's a way that we can understand how emotions are being represented, right? So human emotions are something that are fairly universally understood and recognized. So even if somebody speaks an entirely different language than you, the use of body language, gestures, and so on might convey, oh, that person is happy. I don't know what they're saying, but they're happy, and that helps me understand their message a little bit better. So for example, if you've ever watched a movie that has subtitles, or maybe you've watched a foreign language film and you don't actually know what's being said, there's still a ton that you can pick up on from watching the movie just based on the facial expressions, the tone, all of those things. Well, you don't understand the verbal words, you still understand the nonverbal components through that. So for instance, last night I started watching Squid Game, and I was watching it in the dubbed version, right, that has an English voiceover, but I tried turning that off, and I was still able to understand a lot of what was happening through the characters' nonverbal expressions, their tone, their style, and so on. So we use nonverbal cues a lot, and you might practice and see for yourself sometime. You know, you watch something in a different language without subtitles or a dub, and you might be surprised by what you're still able to recognize. So nonverbal communication includes both its sort of functions and types. So we'll get into both of those. But I think a good starting point is to understand the functions. In other words, what is something that we use nonverbal communication for? So nonverbal communication can be kind of understood through this little visual right here. It has 6 major functions: complementing, contradicting, repeating, substituting, accenting, and regulating. We'll go over each of those 6, and I want to give you kind of an example of each of those 6 in a little bit more detail. Because if nonverbal communication is such a significant part of how we communicate and what we do, we got to understand why we do it and our goals. We might not necessarily even be constantly thinking about or intending for nonverbal communication to fulfill a particular goal, right? It can at times be a tell of how we're feeling. Oh, I'm doing okay, but you seem stressed or tired. You might not mean to seem stressed or tired, but it still gets picked up on by other people. So sometimes nonverbal communication can be very intentional and planned out, and other times it just emerges as we're engaging with other people. So one of the ways that we can use nonverbal communication is through complementing, right? Complementing is the idea that both the verbal and nonverbal communication are kind of in harmony with each other, right? So if I were to say, you did a great job, and I'm giving a thumbs up as I'm saying that, I'm saying and gesturing two different things, right? But the thumbs up is meant to reinforce or help you out to understand, hey, I thought you did a great job. So the thumbs up might mean good or positive, but I say you did a great job. Those things together reinforce the message. Or if you were to say, hey, you did great today in the game, right? And you're giving somebody a high five. That's a way that you can complement your verbal and nonverbal communication. They're not the exact thing that you're saying and doing, but it helps to deliver the message. Right? So if you've watched Marvel movies, like Tony Stark is pretty sarcastic, rolls his eyes a lot, makes fun of a lot of the other Avengers, and that's like an example of contradicting, right? Oftentimes, right, he's at odds with Captain America, and will say, oh, you're America's hero, but he's rolling his eyes, and obviously he's trying to be sarcastic or make fun of him. So contradicting is where you say one thing, but you're meaning another thing, right? And again, we are more likely to understand or read into the nonverbal parts and see that as the truth than the verbal parts, what's being said. Why? Because we can think through our words, we can say something, we can plan out something, but we see the body language that we do as less easy to control or manage. So contradicting basically means that you're going against the original message. Oh, sounds great. So you might have a sarcastic voice, you might be rolling your eyes, and so on. And we use contradicting as a way to sometimes intentionally share information like that, or sometimes we're unintentionally contradicting, and it helps the other person to recognize that and help us out, right? Oh, I'm doing okay, but you're clearly seeming stressed, tired, and so on. That helps the other person to check in and say, are you sure? You don't sound very good. So repeating is the idea that we are, and again, this is somewhat different from complimenting, right? Because you are basically non-verbally doing the exact same thing as what you're saying. So if I were to say yes while like nodding my head, right? That's an example of repeating. Another example of repeating is if I were to say, we are in week 3 of the quarter, and I used, this example of holding 3 fingers up. It's the exact same thing. So while complimenting is supporting the message non-verbally, you did a great job, the thumbs up is not the exact same thing as saying you did a great job, right? In this case, you are non-verbally doing the exact same thing. You might do that to emphasize a point and really drive it home. You might do that if you're speaking a little bit quietly, or it's difficult for somebody to understand either the verbal or nonverbal parts, and so on. Substituting, right? So substituting means that you are not expressing something verbally, you're instead using nonverbal communication to fill in the gaps. So one example of this is the use of emblems, right? So emblems are oftentimes like famous symbols that are used a lot, right? So for instance, the use of the peace sign, right? 2 fingers up can at times be a symbol of peace. It can also be a symbol of victory, right? So it can have some different connotations or forms. You could use it if you got a star in Super Mario 64. It has a lot of different connotations, right? So substituting is filling in for or using a form of nonverbal communication instead of words. Right, it could also be a glare or a look somebody gives you. Hey, do you want to do the dishes today? And somebody just glares rather than saying, no, I don't. So accenting, right? Accenting, again, is the idea, we have got to try this. Or we have got to try this. Or we have got to try this, right? So accenting is within a particular sentence or set of words highlighting or emphasizing different elements. Accenting is used oftentimes as a rhetorical strategy. So sometimes we'll choose to use a pause in order to separate out a key point or idea. Sometimes we'll say a point louder, sometimes we'll look directly at somebody while they did it. But accenting is a way of helping somebody to understand the most important parts of a sentence. Again, you have got to try this versus you have got to try this can be used to help separate these different parts and make sense of the way that we communicate. And interpersonal communication can also be used non-verbally to regulate or manage the relationship. So we can think about our encounters with somebody else interpersonally, whether they're face-to-face or online, as this constant process. So if, for instance, you're talking to a good friend, but they're constantly checking their phone or looking at their watch or looking at the clock, you might think, oh wow, they seem like they're stressed, they've got to get somewhere, maybe I'm going to end the conversation and let them do their next thing. They seem preoccupied, right? So that's the idea of regulating, is that we're managing the relationship. Or we might say, hey, come sit down with me, let's chat, to start a conversation too. You might tap somebody on the shoulder and say, oh, hey, great to see you again, right? So when you first came into the class today, there were a couple of folks who did some kind of nonverbal styles like, oh, hey, it's good to see you, or you waved at another person, right? That's a way that we can use nonverbal communication to regulate or manage the relationships that we have with each other every single day. So again, a lot of this seems pretty straightforward. It's what we constantly do, but I think that these are able to help us to understand and break down those different parts. Because if we deconstruct what nonverbal communication is, that helps us to better relate to one another. So these are kind of the different reasons that we might choose to engage in nonverbal communication. In addition to that, we also have different types or categories of nonverbal communication that we do, right? So we do nonverbal communication for different reasons, but we also do different types of nonverbal communication that can mean very different things. So these can be divided into haptics, which is the role of physical touch and the way that that relates to our communication. Again, under COVID-19, we haven't had nearly as much use of haptics, or it's been very limited, which has affected a lot of the ways that we communicate. We have vocalics, or the use of voice. So how do we use voice to communicate? The words themselves are verbal. The way those words are said in terms of pitch, inflection, tone, and so on are nonverbal. Kinesics is the use of body movement. So the way that we use things such as gestures and so on to communicate with others. So oculesics and facial expressions are how we use the eyes and face behavior. So what does our expression look like? Are we giving somebody eye contact or not? Those are different elements of our communication as well. And then our physical appearance. So we are always communicating to some degree, whether it's face-to-face, our attire and clothing choice matters. If we're on Zoom, right? What does our background look like on Zoom? Or do we have a Zoom background? Are we turning our camera on or off? Those are things that we have to think about constantly, whether it's expressed very clearly or not. So for haptics, or the use of touch, we can go back to that example, right, of tapping somebody on the shoulder and saying, hey, it's great to see you. So haptics is how we use touch to communicate with other people. So haptics has a few different elements, both in terms of its duration, so how long are you doing that, right? So maybe you're seeing a relative, and they're really happy to see you, and they give you a big hug, but they're hugging you for too long, and it starts to get to a point where a hug is really weird. One thing that's interesting is that especially if people go to hug and they don't know each other or feel super comfortable with each other, they're more likely to tap the other person on the back as a way of doing kind of a more casual or brief hug. That's been something that's been identified as how we manage and regulate the duration of that nonverbal communication. Frequency plays a role too. How often do we use nonverbal communication, right? So it can be at times unwanted or undesired, and that's a problem, right? But the degree to which somebody uses nonverbal communication plays a really big role. One example of this is that in a lot of European countries, including in Western Europe, it's common for people who are the same sex and are good friends with each other to use haptics a lot more, right? It's seen as a lot more acceptable to have friends that are holding hands, have their arm over each other's shoulders and are engaged with each other physically in a completely platonic way. Whereas in the United States, oftentimes that's read more in kind of a romantic or intimate light. If you and a friend have their arms over each other or they're holding hands, it might be more likely to be read as you dating. And of course, there's always cultural changes in ways that might be read differently, but it's more likely to be read that way in the United States than in Europe. So as humans, right, we oftentimes like touch. We like physical touch, and that's true since we're babies. But we like the idea of touch on our own terms. We like to feel that it's somebody that we're comfortable with and trust. And of course, with COVID-19 and social distancing, we might feel greater apprehension about physical touch, right? So the appropriateness of touch, kind of as brought up through that example of the United States versus Europe, right, is one example of it depending on culture. What is considered appropriate touch for the other person, right? You might be somebody that's considered really touch-averse. In fact, a lot of folks with disabilities or differences might identify as not being as into touch. So touch can at times be a very sensory or overstimulating experience, or touch can be a great thing, such as the use of Braille as a language to communicate. So vocalics is the use of voice, right? Again, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it when it comes to nonverbal communication. So the use of this can involve things like timbre and pitch. So what is your vocal range? What is the quality or the deepness of the sound that you make, right? So you might think about, for instance, the actor Morgan Freeman being a narrator, right? And a lot of, or voiceover in a lot of examples of, like a documentary and having kind of a very deep, soothing sounding voice. That can be used a lot as a way of understanding how different vocal variety can be very satisfying to us. We also know that if you're a singer, if you've ever done song, you might be able to recognize what voice you fit under, right? So are you a soprano? Are you more of an alto? That depends on your voice, your vocal range, and so on. And this can also get into the role of disfluencies. So one way that we engage in nonverbal communication is through using vocal fillers, saying, well, like those things that are not meant to be a part of your normal speech, but still manage to fit in, fall under nonverbal communication. When I did speech and debate, I had a coach who would throw a wadded up piece of paper at me every time I used a verbal filler. It wasn't fun, but it really helped me to realize just how often we use verbal fillers without thinking about it. If you record yourself and hear your own voice later, you might be surprised by how often we use those. So kinesis, right? If you ever heard of the blobfish, right? It's this silly fish. It's got a really sad face and lives deep in the ocean. So it's an example of how we use things like facial expressions and body behavior to communicate. Right? This fish is very sad. We can tell from its face, but that might just be how it looks. It probably doesn't have a strong emotion right now. So sad fish, using this visual, is a good way to describe some of the ways that we use facial expressions and gestures. Surprise, so we might have a very open, like open our mouths, open our hands. Anger, right? Oftentimes we furrow our brows, we really look down and get very intense with our eye contact. Disgust, right? We might kind of look off to the side, we might get frustrated. Again, Inside Out is a great example of visualizing these emotions. Fear, right? Oftentimes we're going to cower or we might have this shock. Interest, right? We're welcoming, we're going in, we're trying to understand something better. Sadness, again, it's very dejected, it's very down, it's very droopy. And happiness, where we're very open and are expressing that to other people. So SADFISH is a good acronym to describe how we use different emotions in conjunction with our facial expressions. So we use things such as an emblem, like a peace sign, right, which is a symbol to communicate. We also use illustrators. So things such as letter. So if I were to say, like draw out the letter L, right, or the Smash Mouth song, shape of an L on her forehead, right? That's an example of using that. Affect displays and regulators, right, are ways that we can manage our communication as well. So how we nod, wow, I'm really surprised. That gesturing can impact our kinesis as well. Physical distancing and social distancing, right, is something that's brought up a lot, and especially in conjunction with COVID-19 is a really big deal, right? So proxemics is about our physical space relative to other people. How close are you when you're communicating? So this kind of fits under different areas. So we have this kind of intimate space between 8 and 18 inches. Maybe it's a really close friend or family member or romantic partner. We have personal space, which is up to 4 feet, right? That's where you're pretty close and somebody you probably know fairly well. Social space. So the term social distancing has been used all the time in regards to COVID-19, right? So that's 6 to 12 feet. So social distancing, 6 feet or more, is something that we hear used all the time. And then the public space is essentially anything beyond that. And it might involve, you're in an auditorium or you're watching a game and you have that larger distance between people. But your proximity and closeness to somebody else is a tell that we use all the time. If you're standing close to somebody, then, you're really trusting and feeling good with them, and so on. So we also look at the roles that our facial expressions and eye contact can have in relationships too, right? So eye contact is generally seen as a good thing, but the way that we hold a gaze or facial expressions toward other people, that can be something that can mean very different things involving different situations. So for instance, if we are looking at somebody for a really long time, if we are staring them down, we start to feel uncomfortable, right? Why is this person looking at me for so long? So while we like eye contact, we also typically will appropriately break it off or look off to the side for part of the conversation. Again, for folks that might have disabilities or approach eye contact differently, there's a lot of differences in the ways that eye contact is used, right? So for many members of the autistic community, the use of eye contact is seen as overstimulating, it's seen as challenging, and it's something that might not be as comfortable. So facial expressions, again, are conveying how we're feeling and how we're sharing ourselves to other people. So we might be very aware of our facial expressions and know, hey, I look surprised right now. Can you tell I'm surprised or angry? So that can be one way that we use facial expressions to communicate, or it could be totally unintentional. You seem shocked, but you don't know that. You don't know what your face is saying. And then the last kind of major element to think about here is the role of physical appearance. And physical appearance, of course, is deeply linked to cultures, right? Different cultures view physical appearance very differently. One example of this, right, is the idea of weight, where in a lot of non-Western cultures, right, being perhaps heavier or having a larger body size, right, is seen potentially as a positive thing, as a sign of wealth or prosperity, whereas in the United States, while we've definitely seen some movements and pushbacks such as body positivity, there's still this strong desire for being thinner. We see this all the time in advertisements for body products and so on, right? We see this all the time when we talk about fashion with celebrities, right? So one recent example is the Met Gala, where different celebrities, politicians, famous figures were wearing very different attire to correspond to situations, right? So when we engage in physical appearance, again, we're always doing it whether we want to or not. It's sharing both who we are and how we come across to other people. So what we might consider appropriate or attractive definitely depends on the context and situation. So to wrap up what we've talked about for today, we talked a little bit about and gave you the opportunity to do discussion leading. We talked about the purpose and function of nonverbal communication. And then we also talked about how nonverbal communication is expressed in a lot of different ways, such as proxemics, body language, and so on. For next class, I have a short article for you that's available on Canvas that talks about how we use both verbal and nonverbal communication. So since we didn't do a major attendance activity for today, I'll give you a couple options. Either just pass forward a sheet of paper that has your name on it, or alternatively, you can sign off on this sheet of paper here at the front of the room. Otherwise, I hope that you have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll see you again on Friday.